So just took care of turn number 21, July 46. And the war will continue into turn 22 here, January 1947. I needed to roll a 1 or a 7 on the 12-sided die, and I rolled an 11. So the war does continue for at least one more turn. And because of the variable ending, not sure if the game will actually end at the end of that current turn. Some countries are definitely starting to take a few more chances, trying to go out and secure some victory points in case the game does end at the end of this current turn. The problem with that is, some of them are starting to stretch themselves a little too thin, trying to get the victory points. And then if the game doesn't end like it hasn't yet, it weakens them going into the next turn. And case in point for that is definitely the Japanese. So we'll take a look at the Pacific first this turn. And as you can see here in the Pacific, not as many rising sun roundels on the map, especially in the South Pacific. The Allies are starting to slowly but surely take back the money islands from the Japanese. So, and also if you look in China, there's still a bunch of Japanese-held territory, but they're down to 3 units left in mainland China. So Japan is really hurting. They're down to $30. They did collect a bunch of bonuses last turn because at the end of their portion of the turn, they actually were looking pretty decent, but it was pretty much almost everything that they possessed was pretty much defenseless. So that's how the Allies were able to kind of swoop in and take some stuff back. Japan's really in a tough place right now. I think they were down to maybe 3 victory points. Actually, I think it was just 2. I think the Germans had 6, the Italians had 3, and Japan had maybe 2 or 3 themselves. So Japan's definitely in rough shape. They did start the process of building a navy back up. So they dropped a couple light carriers, finished off 5 light cruisers, and put down 4 destroyers. So a little bit of a navy, semblance of a navy's coming back for Japan. Now, they had come out and they had taken Midway and actually Hawaii fell. Honolulu was under Japanese control. And again, that was part of them just taking the chance that the game might end and trying to get some of these victory points. They also came down and spread out. They took the Marshall Islands back. They took the Mariana Islands, used the 5 transports they had in Japanese home water just to send 2 infantry out to a bunch of different islands here in the Central Pacific. The problem with that is that they had no ships to guard the transports, so all the transports have been destroyed by Allied planes here in the Pacific. The Japanese still hold most of the islands they took this last turn, but the infantry are now just stranded on those islands. So again, they were taking a risk, taking a chance that if the game ended this last turn, then it wouldn't have mattered that those transports got picked off. But now that we're continuing another turn at least, definitely not so good for Japan. They also came down, they landed in the Philippines. Now they owned the Philippines, but they beefed it up with a couple infantry and they landed 4 planes down there. And the reason why is they've got to use their Air Force to take out some of these Allied transports that are just slowly but surely eating away all of their income from these money islands. Japan, I think, did collect about $50 last turn with the bonuses and a good roll on the wartime economy, but they're going to probably be expelled from China here on this next turn. They've lost all of their original territories here in the Far East. And again, even all the islands they held are leaving their possession here turn by turn. And not a lot Japan can do. They have no transports left, no men in Japan itself to move around this turn. So not looking so good for the Japanese. The Communist Chinese, they still have a force of 4 fighters that they've built. So the nice little offensive punch to add to all the infantry they've got here in China. And it's going to take them a couple of turns to get all these territories back from Japan, even though they're not defended for the most part, just because the infantry are only moving one space per turn. But they'll have those. The Far East Command now came out. They took Siam, and they're now right at the doorstep of British Malaya, and there's nothing in there. Japan could be putting some militia units down in some of these spots, but their income, like I said, hasn't been the greatest, and they've been devoting it to try to build the Navy back up. So British Malaya will fall this turn. Also, the Far East Command came out and took Java. Anzac came over and took Borneo. So now those three money islands here, because the West Indies was already under Anzac control. So those three have been taken off. And those are two of the extra income bonuses, Borneo and Java. Those were bringing in, besides their value in IPP, they were also bringing in $4 worth of bonuses for Japan. So now that's gone. The Australians also have a nice fighter force here in Dutch New Guinea. So if the Japanese kind of encroach too close, they can send out those fighters to pick off some ships like they did the transports this last turn. Anzac also put down another transport and a destroyer, so they're going to move these couple of guys out of Sydney this next turn. The U.S., they came back and they took Hawaii back. That's a force of about 6 or 7 destroyers, 3 transports, 3 tanks, 3 medium armor, and 3 infantry. They also finished off 5 light carriers and bought 3 more transports, and they had the planes to land on the light carriers. And these 3 transports, again, if the game continues, it's going to have to continue at least a couple of more turns for these transports to matter. But if it does, these transports are going to come out and pick up the 3 medium armor and the 3 infantry that have been stranded on Wake Island. So the U.S., between these 2 little fleets of transports, are going to have a decent amount of ground units they can possibly land in Japan. Not this next turn, but if the game continues the turn after that. So Japan's going to probably also have to worry about putting some units down into Japan to defend Tokyo itself. So all kinds of problems for the Japanese. The Russians in the Far East finally went on the move. A combination of the fact that Japan is so weakened that they don't really have to worry about the Japanese coming after their Far East territories, but then also the fact that they've lost everything, all the territories they had gained in the European theater. So to get some of the victory points, they're now positioning themselves to storm into Mongolia on this next turn. They just moved everything up. So they'll be able to probably take both of these Mongolian territories that have IPP value this next turn, which will definitely help with their victory objectives. So in the Pacific, the Axis in all kinds of trouble. But in Europe, on the European side, the Germans really are starting to exert some serious pressure on the Russians. I think it's a matter of the Germans have just been pouring pretty much every dime they have into the Eastern Front. So that's like starting to gradually wear down Russia. Again, if this game goes not one more turn, but a couple turns, 3 turns for sure, I think the Germans could be in Moscow. So up in northern Russia here, Leningrad, again, it's been a seesaw battle, but Leningrad is now firmly in German hands. There's nothing the Russians can do about that. That's about 15 self-propelled artillery and about a dozen motorized or mechanized infantry. And then in Finland, there's another half a dozen mechs right behind. So definitely no chance the Russians are taking Leningrad back. In the central section of the front here, there's only the single mech, but the Germans have about a half a dozen fighters and about 8 Stukas right there. And then in southern Russia, the Germans have temporarily pulled back, so the Russians have a little bit of respite down there. They've kind of regrouped in Romania. They've got about 4 medium armor, 3 Tigers, about 3 fighters. They got these 5 self-propelled artillery right next door to Romania. So, but the problem is again, the Germans have been gradually grinding down the Russian units. And as you can see, there really isn't anything left here in northern Russia. So the Germans are going to bust through there, and they're going to be right next door to Moscow at the end of this turn. And I don't think the Russians are going to be able to counterattack and take away this territory here, Western Russia, that's going to be German on this next turn. And even in southern Russia, the Russians are probably going to have to pull these tanks back just to defend Moscow, which in turn will leave southern Russia open for the Germans to re-enter down there. So not a lot of options for the Russians. The Germans landed in Transcaucasia. They also have another Fallschirmjäger with an air transport here in Romania to move. So the Russians did buy 5 cavalry. They were going to send them down there to take Transcaucasia back. But then you leave Stalingrad open, and then this Fallschirmjäger could land there. So Russia has a lot of worries here with Germany. The Allies really haven't been able to interfere at all. They never created a second front, at least in Europe. I mean, I guess you can consider North Africa a second front to a certain extent, but they never landed in the soft underbelly of Europe, which in this game was never that soft, at least soft enough for the Allies to land. And they definitely never landed back in Western Europe. So for the most part, other than a couple of turns when the Germans built up a U-boat fleet, almost everything Germany has produced for about 10 turns or so now has gone to the Russian front. So it's just gradually wore down the Russians. The Germans also built 8 men they were able to put here because they have improved factories. So this major factory produces more than just 5 units. And now this stack of transports that's sitting out of Leningrad can just come over 1 and 2 and land them back in Leningrad this turn to put even more units on the Russian front. So I actually think that depending on how the variable die roll ending goes, that Russia could fall within a couple of turns. We'll see. The British actually, now that the Germans had sent their entire air force to the east, they don't have to worry about losing ships. They actually put 5 destroyers down this turn. So again, if the Germans' air force stays occupied on the eastern front, the British have no worries about their ships being sunk. So now they're actually going to put transports down this coming turn and maybe be able to get some units into Western Europe. Paris is still pretty well defended. That's a stack of about a dozen men. But even Western Germany's been kind of laid bare. There's about 5 men and 1 fighter. So we'll see if the British can finally start applying some pressure to the Germans to take away their focus, at least completely, on the Russians. As far as the Americans go, we remember from last turn, the U.S. fleet got destroyed here by the German fighters and a couple of U-boats, so these men are stuck there. The fighters they kept here for now because there wasn't really too much damage they can do anywhere. I didn't want to lose fighters going after single men on some of these Italian islands. So they stayed where they are because, again, if the game continues, they're going to try to get these men off of Africa and into Italy somewhere. And to that end, the U.S. bought 4 transports they put over here. So, and again, with the German Air Force pulled towards the Russian front, not a lot of danger at this point in these transports getting sunk. So they're going to try to get over to Africa. They'll be able to make it on this turn if the U.S. so desires, maybe combining with some of the British destroyers as protection so they can pick up these men and get them into the fight. Other than that, Africa stayed pretty quiet. None of the units even really moved around. Now, the British did actually come out. They took a risk of losing planes, and they took out the 1 airborne infantry the Italians had in Cyprus, Crete, and Malta. So all 3 of those are now completely defenseless. The problem is, for the time being, there's no naval or air transports the Allies have anywhere near these islands to take them back. So as things stand, Italy's going to get a victory point for having territories, regardless of the IPP value that they did not hold at the beginning of the game. So, but that was maybe a first step the British are taking in terms of and hopefully getting those islands back. The other problem, though, is not only don't they have transport, they only have 1 ground unit here anywhere near, the Middle East over here in Iraq. So the British are also going to have to start producing some ground units that, that they can move onto those islands to try to take that victory point away from the Italians. As far as the Italians themselves, they're down to just collecting $9 a turn minus bonuses in the wartime economy roll. So not looking so good. They had a couple dollars left over from the last turn as well. So they bought a fighter and a tactical. So now in northern Italy, they've got 3 fighters, 1 tactical. They do still have some air transports, and they still do have 2 airborne infantry. They did not move those 2 this turn. And they did use the 3 fighters they had at the beginning of this turn to come down here and take out the British light cruiser and torpedo boat destroyer. Now, they did lose a fighter in return, so that was kind of painful, but that eliminated all the Allied ships in the Mediterranean, so they get that wartime bonus back by having no Allied ships in the Med. So it was kind of a little bit of a trade-off, I guess, for Italy. Another thing is, if going back to talking about Stalingrad, for instance, now that the Germans have Leningrad secured with no chance of the Russians taking that back, if they can get Stalingrad, then that activates Spain as an ally for the Germans. So not sure that really is going to make too much of a difference. If we look in Spain, they don't really have a lot going on. And actually, that opens the door for the Allies to possibly land there as well. So I'm not even sure that would be, especially this late in the game, that big of a bonus. But we'll see what happens. Maybe the Russians will decide to fortify Stalingrad instead of maybe trying to go back after the Transcaucasus here in southern Russia. We'll have to see how that plays out. So that's that. As far as tech, we haven't looked at tech in a while. So as you can see, and clearly this is, how I would think, unless you roll horribly, as the game goes on, you're going to have a lot of technology completed. I mean, the Germans, for instance, are getting 5 tech rolls a turn, the 4 major factories they own, plus they get 1 extra roll bonus. So they've actually completed 9 technologies right now. So, and the Japanese have completed 6 and the Italians 2. So not too bad for the Axis. And then income-wise, Germany's way up there at $68. They're actually collecting non-bonus money. They're actually collecting the most right now. And that's just going to increase with the territories they're going to take off of Russia this turn. Japan down to 30, and Italy bringing up the rear there with only 9. And then as far as the Allies, they're actually not doing quite as well for tech. The U.S. has 7 technologies. The British have 8, and the Russians have 6. So, and then for income, the U.S. is clearly in the lead with 65. Russia's hanging in there a little bit with 36, but again, they're going to lose probably, I would say, about 6 or 8 IPPs worth of territory this turn. The British at 24, Communist China at 13, but that fluctuates because they're going to be taking some of these empty territories back away from Japan. They've actually been hovering around 19 or 20 when it comes to the collect income part of their turn. And then actually Anzac and Far East Command have been moving up. They've both been in single digits for a while. So they're actually back up into double digits. And as far as the victory points, 13, I think that's actually 11 now for the Axis because Japan lost 2 this last turn. The Allies are still at 6, and the Comintern is still at 4. So the Axis still are holding on to a victory, but each turn that goes by, unless the Germans can make up for what's happening with Japan and Italy, the victory is slipping slowly from the Axis grasp each turn that this game continues.